So I'm going to try to keep this really simple. A lot of you out there might be making video content already and thinking about using a different video editing software. Some of you have never tried it before, and I want to make this really simple so that if you've never tried it before, you could download this software for free and get started on one of your own projects for potentially putting up onto YouTube. So as a lot of you know, I stopped using Filmora to edit my videos, and recently I've been using DaVinci Resolve. I've liked DaVinci Resolve, one, because it has a great free version that you can download right now, and it has tons of features, no limitations in terms of watermark. The limitations that do exist is there's some features that aren't accessible to you. And the difference in upgrading to the studio or paid version, which is a one-time license fee currently, we've been down that road before, that's going to allow you to access the GPU acceleration and allow you to have some of those more advanced effects work more efficiently on your system. The first thing I want to mention is make sure that your system significantly exceeds the minimum system requirements. One of the things that can instantly create a bad video editing experience is when you try to run a more advanced video editing software like DaVinci Resolve is on an older or slower computer or laptop, and it just can't keep up with the system demands. It takes a lot of resources to edit video, especially when you move into 4K and create a lot of tracks. So make sure that you've covered that step first. So let's start with the basics here. So the very first thing is when you do open DaVinci Resolve, make sure you run it as administrator. I'm doing this on PC. Running any software as the administrator opens up all functionality and can limit some potential problems down the line. Once the software is open, you're going to see a window like this. Now, I've worked on a bunch of projects, so you're seeing a lot of things right here listed. But when you open it for the first time, it'll be blank. In either case, if you want to start a new project, what you want to do is click on that new project. It'll open up a very small window where you want to title your project. So let's call this one DaVinci Resolve Test. Then just hit create. And you'll notice that the software opens up to what they call the cut page. This is one of the areas I really want to talk to you about, not getting confused about. DaVinci Resolve has 7 different pages. And if we scroll at the bottom and hover over each, you'll see the names of them. The first one is called the Media tab. That's basically a page, as they call it, not a tab, but a page that focuses on all the assets that you would bring in, like your video clips or your images, or maybe the music that you might be playing behind your audio, or even your main audio track if you've recorded your vocals separately than your video. The second page that it defaults to here is called the cut page, and that's where you can start assembling things. But the reality is these first 2 pages, you can kind of ignore as a noob. I'm going to focus you on the third page or the third tab right here, and that's called the edit page. So let's go to the edit page, and this is where you can really just sit and get started making a project. Now, the very first thing you want to think about is making sure that the settings of your project are where you want them to be. Now, in the upper left, if I click on that File menu and scroll down to Project Settings, it's going to open up this window. And it's got a lot of different things going on here. Don't get bogged down on every detail, okay? Some of the default settings are pretty good. Let's just make sure we have it set up for the kind of project that you're creating. In my case, I'm going to be working with footage that's probably 4K. It defaults to this 1080p, which is high def, but not 4K. So you'd want to scroll down if you want to make sure that your project is true to the footage that you're using. And you actually want to go to the 4K setting, which is, in my case, not true 4K. It's Ultra HD 3840 by 2160. You then want to make sure that the frame rate for your project is set. Typically, that's the same frame rate as your footage that you're going to bring in. So you can set that here, or when you bring the footage in, it'll give you a prompt and ask you if you'd like to match your project to the footage that you're bringing in. So we'll leave this at 24 right now. I tend to film somewhere around 24 frames per second anyway. And that's really it. As you go down, you'll see some other areas where we'll have the ability to optimize the software to perform a little smoother. But I'm going to put all that information at the end, because one thing that I hate when people are trying to teach us about a software is they start going through every little button along the way. And instead of just taking me from here to there, they have to point out everything along the way. And that can get confusing, to me at least. I like it simple. Show me how to do the simple things, and then let me learn the extra features later on when I really need them. So for right now, set your project and let's call it a day. Let's just say save. And now our project settings are roughly sketched out to what we want. Now, looking at this page, I want to quickly just show you what we have going on. This upper left section here, that's where you're going to be bringing all of your footage and your assets in. So that's sort of like your big file cabinet where you'll bring in video and audio and images and all of that. This middle section here is your preview window. That's where you're going to see what's actually happening in your project. Down below, this main area here is your timeline, and that's where you're going to be assembling all of the pieces together. Your video pieces, your audio pieces, the images that you might bring in. That's your timeline. Most of you are familiar with these basic windows that you would see in any video editing software. Now, over to the left here, in the lower left, is sort of your toolbox. That's where there's going to be things like video transitions and audio transitions, and things like titles if you want to add text to put over your footage. That'll be right over here in the lower left. Now in the upper right, there's this area that they call the inspector. And I'll show you what that does as we move forward, but basically it gives you a deeper dive into the pieces that you're going to bring into this timeline. So let's start really simple. I'm going to just go in the upper left, and when I build a project, I like to create a file structure so I know where things are. I don't want to have one big box that has all the video clips and all the audio clips all stuffed together, and then it's really hard to figure out where things are when you're scrolling through. So in DaVinci Resolve, they don't really call them files when you separate things. They call them bins. So we're going to use the word bin, but when I say bin, I just mean file. Just like on your computer, you might create a new file to put things in. So the easiest way to do this is in the upper left in this open area. Let's just right click, scroll down, and add a new bin. Now, as it's sitting there, just like adding a folder on your PC, it's ready to be renamed. I like to create 3 basic bins: video, audio, and then images. Images being static pictures that I might use in my project. Whether I use those or not, those are my 3 basic file systems that I like to create for any project. So let's call this first one video. Now let's do that again. We'll repeat that process, click on new bin. We'll call the second one audio. That's where we'll put all of our audio files. And we'll do that one more time, create a new bin, and this one we'll call images. So now I have 3 basic files that I can put stuff into as I'm building my project. Now, if I were going to bring in video, the first thing I'd want to do is open up the video file by double left clicking on it. And now I'm inside of that video file in the project. And let's right click in that open area again and start bringing stuff in. If I scroll down, you'll see it says import media. Perfect. That's what I want. I want to go find a clip to bring in here. So I'm just going to find a clip that I have. And you see when I'm going to start to bring this clip in, it's a slightly different frame rate than that 24 frames per second. And DaVinci Resolve is asking me, would you like to change the project to the same frame rate as your footage? And in this case, I actually do. So I'm going to click change. I want to make sure the project and the footage that I'm using is the same frame rate. So I've now done that. And in the upper left, you'll see there's my piece of footage. Right up in the upper left inside of that video bin. Now, if I want to bring this down into my timeline, I just grab it and I just drag it down by left clicking and holding. And you'll see in the timeline, I now have the audio and the video together. You see the blue on top is my video, and that green below it is the audio track that goes with that video file. It's all one file, but when you bring it into DaVinci Resolve, it's separating it visually for you. There's a little scroll bar. If you look right under this preview window up here, see this sliding bar? That allows me to zoom in on that timeline. If I go to the left, it zooms out so you can see more things that are in the timeline. If I left click and hold and push this to the right, it allows me to zoom in a bit. You'll use that a lot when you're really trying to get the perfect little cut in between scenes. You want to zoom way in and make sure that you can see everything that's going on and get the cut right where you want it. Now, for how to approach a very simple type of project like this, where you're bringing some footage in and cutting it up, the very first thing I try to do is look at the footage and get the color to the point I want it. That way, I'm not cutting up all the footage and then having to go back and color correct each little segment that I may have cut up. If I get that done the first time, as I cut the footage up, each little piece will already be somewhat color corrected or color graded so that it looks a little bit better. As I'm looking at this, it seems the footage is a little bit dark. This is footage from the music video I did with Samantha and Carrie. So I'm going to take a look at this and see if I can brighten this up. Now, to do color changes, you got to go to a different page. You will see I'm currently on the edit page, but if I go over 2 tabs, that little color wheel right there, that's the color page. So if we click on that, it's going to open up this color page. So that's the piece of footage. And if I want to see the timeline in the upper right, if I click on timeline, it'll now show me what's in the timeline. I only have 1 clip there, and that's where I'm at, that 1 clip. And I can even click right next to it in the upper right, clips, and it'll show me the individual clips in the timeline. So if I had many little pieces, they would all show up right here above it. So I like to keep that enabled personally because I always like to have an overview of what I'm working on. So I've only got one clip, but I'm going to double left click on it. That's the one. You'll see it's now surrounded in that orange color. That's what I'm going to adjust the color for. Now, DaVinci Resolve is known as being pretty much the pinnacle of color grading for video editing software. It just doesn't get any better. Unfortunately, that means it's also pretty complex and there's a lot to learn. I'm going to stay very simple today. All I'm going to do is I'm looking at the scopes over on the right, which tells me right off the bat, I can make these a little bit bigger so you can see them. I'm going to open that up. You can see there seems to be a little more red, a little less green, and even less blue. There's a color grading. It was very kind of reddish orange in the club that night. I'm just going to try to balance the color a little bit. If we're looking at the default color section that we're on here on the lower left, that's your primaries. What I kind of think about these as is this section here is your darks. This middle section here is more like your midtones. The third section here is sort of like the higher frequencies, the brightest frequencies. And then the farthest to the right, the offset, is like the master. That brings everything up and everything down. So if you kind of start here, you'll have a pretty good place to start at least dialing the basics in. And if you notice around these meters, there's all these little areas that talk about separate color features, like color boost, shadows, highlights, saturation, hue, things like that. Up top, you can see contrast, you can see tint, temperature. These are really great little features that help you dial in this color, and there's tons of them, but here's a great place to start this particular window. So the first thing I notice is it is a little dark, this footage. So the first thing I'm going to do is I can individually bring up colors in here, or down below there's this master wheel for each one of these. I'm going to left click on the mids and I'm going to pull it to the right and just try to dial those all up. And if you look at the scope, you can see everything coming up all together, all of those mids. So I'm trying to bring up some of the midtones, right? And you can see the footage, if I pull this out of the way, is getting a little bit brighter. Right up here in the upper right, you can see there's a reset button. Watch the color difference. I will reset the mids back to dark. So now that my mids are up, I could come over to the highs and say, should I bring the highs up a little? Sure, that helps the footage a bit. Real simple moves, a little bit of the mids, a little bit of the highs. I'm not trying to change the color too much at this point. If I thought there were issues individually, like as I brought up the highs, maybe some of the skin tones get a little too bright, I could do things like come down to the highlights and just roll back by left clicking and slowly pulling my mouse to the left. I can pull back some of the highlights. Or I could also go into these separate sections of low, mid, and high, and I could do things like maybe I just want to pull some of the overall brightness of that high down a touch so it's not overwhelming. But that's completely up to your eye. You can use these scopes to the right to see if something's oversaturated. There's a little bit of clipping in the high up top. I'm not going to get into that. But basic color changes, just trying to bring some of the brightness up, some of the contrast, some of the mids, and just trying to get your footage to look a little more balanced. So there's a simple color grading, and now I have my color figured out for this clip. I can go back to the edit page, and now I can start making some changes. Now, maybe there's areas that I want to cut out of this footage. So I would scroll through. I can use that zoom tool to find things. I can scroll through either grabbing the playhead and pulling it, or I could even use my arrow keys on my keyboard, and I can just hold over to the right or hold over to the left. There's also a JKL feature. If you use JKL on your keyboard, L gets it to play forward. Hitting L twice gets it to play twice as fast. Hitting K will pause it. And then hitting J will do the opposite. It'll go backwards. One time hitting the J makes it play backwards. 2 times hitting the J will make it play backwards twice as fast. And so on. You can actually go 3 times and make it go faster and faster. Really simple tricks that you can learn later on. All we're learning today is really how to get our footage in, cut it up a little bit, change the color to make it look a little better, put it all together, maybe add some titles, and then send it out. So as you can see here, if I were in an area that I found I wanted to cut something out, what I would do here is I would put the playhead where I wanted to make a slice. And let's say I really wanted to zoom in. I would use that zoom in scroll bar right here, the zoom bar. I'd find the spot that I want to slice. And there's a couple of ways to do this. The easiest way I found is on your keyboard, just hit Control and B, and it'll slice all of this footage. And if you can see, these are now separated sections. So I've now made a cut in the footage. I can scroll back out, and let's say I wanted to cut everything over to here. What I could do is yet again, hit Control and B where the playhead is, and this is going to cut these pieces out. Now, if these are all linked together and both are highlighted, and I want to remove that section now, that little piece that I just cut out, In this particular situation, what I can do is I can either hit delete on my keyboard, or I could right click and use cut. There's a slight difference between the two when you're in this sort of standard mode that I want to show you. If I have both pieces of these highlighted, the footage and the audio track that's connected to it, and I hit delete, watch what happens in my timeline. See how it pulls those together? So it does that ripple delete where it removes the section and pulls the other two pieces together. If you were in a situation where you didn't want it to pull together, what you could do is you could select those two pieces and instead right click and choose cut. Cut will take it out and then it won't ripple delete. It will allow you to leave that space. Now you could ripple delete afterwards simply by clicking in the space between the footage that you've left. Right click on that and choose ripple delete and it'll bring those things over. Or you could just slide them over depending on which your preference is. If you do choose a section like this video and this audio and then right click, you'll see at the bottom, there's an option to link the clips. That will make sure that they're linked together. So if you do a ripple delete like this, where you right click and ripple delete, it'll tell you if they're out of time and you can lock them so that they will go, but it'll always let you know that if things have fallen out of sync and one isn't moving or one is moving. So now you have a basic idea of how to bring things into your project and then bring them down into your timeline and start cutting up your footage and removing the pieces and moving them around. The next thing you might want to do when you find yourself cutting pieces of footage together is maybe add a video transition. Now I'm using the studio version, so I'm going to have a few more transitions and options than the free version does. But in general, if you were at a section like this where two pieces of footage came together and you wanted to add a transition, all you need to do is go over to this left under this toolbox menu, and you'll see it says video transitions. Click on video transitions, and you'll start seeing the transitions that are available to you. If there are some in the free version that are not available and you try to click them and bring them over, it'll give you a warning saying that that's a paid feature and you need to upgrade to use it. But let's start with something very simple like a cross dissolve where we're dissolving between two pieces of footage. What's really cool is if you put the playhead where you're thinking about that transition, before you even ever make a choice, you can actually go over to cross dissolve. And right here, just scroll left and right. It'll show you what that effect will look like on the footage in your timeline, like a preview. And you can go, oh, is that the effect I'm looking for? Or maybe the effect I wanted was the one above it, blur dissolve, where you can actually look and see what it might do once you brought it in without actually bringing it in first. I like the cross dissolve. I'm just going to bring that in. I'm going to drop it into the timeline. See how I'm placing it? I could place it on the first piece of footage, the second piece of footage, or I can drop it right in the middle. That's typically where I do a cross dissolve. And the length of the cross dissolve, how long it takes to fade in and fade out of each, is defined by how far you stretch it. So if you left click and hold either side of this, the left or the right of that transition in your timeline, you can change the length of that dissolve. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but as I'm playing here with this dissolve, up in that right window, remember that inspector area that we talked about? As I've clicked on that thing in the timeline, it now gives us sort of a deeper amount of options so I can really start changing the way that transition works. But that's true of everything in your timeline. If I choose a piece of video footage, let's go back to the first piece of footage and I left click on that. In the upper right, you'll now see that if I click on the video tab, that's where I can really start modifying this footage by doing things like zooming in, zooming out. I could change the position left to right. So if I do zoom in and I want to move more to the left and maybe focus on carry, the X will allow me to go left and right. And then the Y here will allow me to go up and down. So you can see I'm going up and down, zooming in on carry a bit, and my fuzzy little head in the way. Down below it, you'll see options for doing things like cropping your footage or trying to do a composite where you can blend areas. Those are all those kind of deeper features where you can really dive into the piece of footage itself. But for now, I'm not going to do any of that zooming or cropping. That's where it would be. For now, we're just going to try to do some simple cuts, transitions, maybe add some text and see if we can get this thing completed. If you do something like this and you want to reset, you can see there's all these little circular wheels with an arrow. Those will reset back to the original, either individual things like the positioning or the zoom itself. Or if you just want to reset everything in this transition section, the very top recycle will do that. Click on it and you'll be fine. So now that we have a couple pieces of footage of transition in there, let's think about adding some titles. That's something you might want to do. Add text on top of your video that you're going to put onto YouTube. So over in the left, you can see there are options for titles right under that toolbox menu. Let's click on titles and we're going to go down to the text plus. There's text and text plus, and as far as I can see, Pretty much text is basic text, and Text Plus gives you more advanced options to do more with the text if you're trying to create a bit more of a text effect of some kind. But let's grab Text Plus, and we're just going to bring that into our timeline. Now, wherever I bring that in the timeline is where the text is going to happen. I can left click and hold and drag that around. And maybe I want it here. So there's my text. And if you see up here in the preview window, it just says custom title. Now, if you look in the inspector, because I have that text selected in my timeline, that inspector is where I get in and I start modifying the text, just like I did with the footage or the transition. So up there, I don't want it to say custom title. So let's change that to rock and roll video. So those words are now here. I can do things like choose the type of font that I want to use by just opening up the font selection and scrolling down. You'll see them all change on screen. Choose whatever font makes sense for you. Definitely not that one. That'll give you your font selection. Now you can see here, you can also control the size of that font, different ways that it's anchored and spun and moved around. You can really get deep with the Text Plus. Right now, we've just made some text. We now have it controlled. We have it sort of the font we want, the size we want, but it's in the wrong position. It's sitting dead center in the middle of my video edit. Maybe I want that down below so it's not blocking our faces. So in the upper right, instead of the title section, let's click over to settings. And that's just like the video portion where we can access the ability to zoom in, zoom out, move it around left and right, up and down. You can see the zoom here. I can grab it. I can zoom in. It gets closer to us. I can zoom out. But let's go with that X and Y area. We know X is left and right, and we know Y is up and down. So let's bring it down. Let me try bringing it down to here somewhere. Now, if I wanted it like a lower third, I could actually slide it over and say, hey, rock and roll video, lower third down in the corner. And there's a little bit of text that I've just instantly added onto my video. Now, if I want to check my audio along the way, you'll see in the right, there is a little mixer that's popped up. That's basically the main audio and then the bus, or where it's filed through to go out to the master. This is my single track, audio 1. I can rename that. I can just call that the main footage, so that I know what all of these are. If I were adding a lot of different tracks, I could separate them because of the name. So that's going to control my volume. And if I were playing this piece of footage, you can see maybe it's peaking a little loud. I could bring it down if I want. A little into the red isn't bad, but that'll control the individual track that I can control the volume right there. And then the bus on the right is, think of that as more like your master. So if I had a bunch of tracks that were all not peaking, but then the overall volume was peaking a little loud, I can control the master here by bringing that bus down. If I wanted to dive deeper into this audio, we could go to the second to last page of DaVinci Resolve. That's what they call Fairlight. And Fairlight is just their word for the audio page. That's where you can really dive deep and change the effects, change the EQ, add compression, do all kinds of really great mixing inside of DaVinci Resolve. It's literally like its own digital audio workstation. And if I open that up, go over and click on that Fairlight page, this is your whole mixer section. So this is all audio. So I've got these tracks here. You'll see the mixer. I'm only using one. The more I add over on this right, the more faders will show up for each track. And if you see above it, that's where I can add some of these things. If I double left click on the dynamics, you'll see I have the ability to add an expander or noise gate, which can quiet down noise in between when I'm speaking. I can add a compressor, a limiter, stop the vocal from peaking too much. I could also click on things like the EQ section here, double left click on that. And this opens up a really nice parametric EQ that I can start deciding to roll off some of the lows, left click, hold, roll off some of the highs, pull down some of the mids, pop them up just by left clicking and holding some of these points, or dialing them in from the control knobs down below. And then I can dial in also the gain, the overall volume of everything if the track happens to be a little quiet. This is the last stage, is we're going to want to export this footage. Now that we have the cuts done, we have the color corrected, we've added some transitions, we've added some text. Now we want to be able to export our project. So what you want to do is go to the final page over here. You'll see that's called the deliver page. There's some words in here that are sort of unnatural. I would just say export, right? So you have to sort of learn some of the language. It's a bit like being in a Starbucks. When you order a coffee, instead of a large, you're going to learn a venti or a grande or whatever that might be. So just kind of learning some of the language inside of DaVinci is one of the things that'll happen as you play with the footage, and it'll make sense in your head. So if you look on this left section, this is where we're going to control the exact type of export that we want for this project. Now, I'm not going to do custom export. I'm going to do an H.264 master. You could do a custom one, an H.265. There's lots of options for what you're exporting. You can even export directly up to places like YouTube, Vimeo, Twitter, right to Dropbox. But I personally like exporting all my projects locally, so they're right onto my computer where I know exactly where everything is. I can look at them, check them out, make sure the mix is right, and then I upload it to YouTube. So let me start with a local one. I'm clicking on H.264 master. That's sort of a very standard compression. As I scroll down, I'm going to need to name this file. I can't even remember what we called this project from the beginning, but we're going to call it the Resolve test video. That's what I'm going to call it for now. And then below it, you're going to pick your location. Where on your computer do you want that file saved? And there's a browse button there. If you click on browse, it'll open up your typical Explorer browser from Windows. It'll allow you to choose a place to put your footage. For right now, I'm just going to put it on the desktop, and you'll see it's called the Resolve test video. It's going on the desktop. Click save. Now down below, this is a couple things that you want to watch out for right off the bat. DaVinci Resolve seems to default to QuickTime as a format. QuickTime is more of an Apple or Mac delineation. It's what we often see referred to as like a .mov file. But for me and for most people, we're going to probably be exporting an MP4, which is the more common and preferred video file format type for uploading onto YouTube. So I'm going to scroll down and click on MP4. Below that, you don't have to worry about too much. It's an H.264. We'll let the encoder be automatic, and all this stuff below right now, we really can just kind of go with the defaults off the bat. As you get more advanced, you can start playing around with the exact type of export you want, but this is where we're going to start. The only other thing you probably want to look at is up above here, we're on the video tab for our export. Make sure you click on the audio export and make sure that you have audio enabled, because you want to make sure that box is ticked. And then think about the type of encoder that you might need. For most of this, just leave it be unless you want to change some of the bit rate and things and bring them down, or the sample rate. I tend to keep these whatever the project already is, whether it's 44.1 or 48. For now, we'll just leave it exactly what the project was recorded at. Now, once I've done these things, this simple setup, I also along the way want to make sure if I might have changed the project settings to make the project run smoother, that I revert back to the full definition files. So in the upper left, let's quickly check on the file type. And if we look at project settings again, if I may have been using 4K footage, but keeping the project at 1080 along the way, this is where you'd want to put it back to 4K to make sure we get a full 4K export. But I'm going to leave this at 1080. Everything's fine. And at this point, once I've got this all set up and all the parameters are clicked and set, what I want to do is down in the lower left, I want to click on Add to Render Queue. And what happens is it'll take all the information I just told it about this project, and it's going to put it in the upper right. And it'll say, that's what we're going to export right now, this project. And it holds on to that settings for this timeline. Now, there could be a situation where I only wanted to export like a piece of this project. Now, this is really interesting with DaVinci Resolve. If we go back in the timeline, let me click on the timeline here. Let me put the playhead somewhere in the middle. Click right here, and I'm going to put Mark In. See that option, Mark In? All of a sudden, the project now starts here as a marker. Let's say I go a little bit past it down in the timeline, and I move that playhead and right-click again. I could choose Mark Out. I've now decided a different amount of the timeline that I want to export. I can do this. I can actually make a separate export without even affecting the one I just made. So what I do is I go back up to the upper left and I say the same thing, H.264. Let's look at the video settings. Let's make sure it's not QuickTime. It seems to always default back to that. Let's go back to MP4. Leave everything else set as auto. Make sure that the audio is set to also export. And now that I have this section defined, I can actually click again, Add to Render Queue. And now there is a separate project within my project ready to export. Just that shorter clip. But it didn't affect the main one. So I can now decide what I want to export. Now in the upper right, if you look, I can select them, right? I could select one or I could select more. If I hold the Control key on my keyboard and then click both, now they're both selected and I could hit this Render All and it will export them one at a time. Pretty cool, huh? But I don't need them both right now. I just want the main project. It now says render one. Let me click on that. And as you can see, now DaVinci Resolve goes through the process of exporting the entire file as I defined it for that export up top. and it gives you progress along the way. You can see how quickly it's exporting. This tends to go pretty quickly. I will say the studio version runs faster than the free version because of that GPU acceleration. But in general, even the free version moves pretty quickly if your project isn't really complex and have a lot of tracks and color changes and effects laid on top. And once it's done, in the upper right, you'll see where it says it's completed. Now, I want to give you a couple of tips to make your project move a little smoother if it's been stumbling on you at all or getting bogged down from different things being added to your project. One of the tips that I would give you is if your project is all in 4K, go up to that file setting, go down to project settings, click on that. You'll see here what the current project is set at. Now, if you are using 4K footage or Ultra HD footage like I do, here you can set it back to 1080p while you're working on it. Just make sure at the end when you go to export, you put it back up to that higher resolution, 3840 by 2160, so you get the full resolution you were looking for. Also, right below that, you'll see this box that says Optimize Media and Render Cache. Here's where you can actually start choosing what size render files you want the software to create when it makes those files. You could choose that these files will only be half of that amount of information when they're rendered, or even less. You could do a quarter if you want. But when you render these down and create files that have less information and less data, the software is going to have more ability to be able to run through your timeline without getting bogged down. So choose what that might be ahead of time before you start using any render features. Let's go with half, and then just click save. If you do have an area where things are getting bogged down, you can't do this in the export page, but you can do it back in that editing page. Go back to the edit page, and you can either choose individual clips, or you can even click in this gray area and create a box and select multiple things. Here I'm selecting 2 pieces of footage and the transition, and then just right click, and you'll see up here, render in place. What that will do is allow you to create a rendered version of these things in your timeline that have less information, easier for the software to handle. And when it exports at the very end, it'll go back to the original pieces and use those for the final export. So you can quickly define what type of format and everything you'd like it to be depending on your preferences. And then you click render. But one of the things you have to pay attention to is it wants to know where you'd like to store these rendered files. A lot of times I'll create a project file on the side where I leave my final mixes, my render files, and build that so that all of those things are in one place. So choose where you'd like the rendered file to go, select folder, and it immediately starts rendering all of these things that are going on here. That'll allow the project to move smoother as that playhead's moving through your timeline if it is getting bogged down. Now, another thing you want to think about doing is back up here in the upper left. See where it says playback? If you click on that and scroll down, you'll see there's a few options. One, proxy handling. This is where the software is basically going to say, do you want us to defer to the proxies when we're playing something back, or do you want us to use the originals? So make sure you do have prefer proxies checked so that it does know to use those when it's playing back. Down below that is the render cache. I tend to leave that at smart, and it tends to do its own thing because it does sort of render files along the way. It's actually doing it intelligently and looking at what's going on in my timeline. And as I play through, it'll slowly start rendering wherever the playhead has already gone over. Sometimes you might fight the fact that it hasn't rendered the footage yet and you're trying to play it, and you might see it skip or bog down or lag. That just means on your project, DaVinci is trying to finish the rendering process, so let it do that and get all the way through as you're playing. You'll find that if you rewind and play again, suddenly the footage plays a lot smoother because it's rendered it through. The other thing you want to make sure up here is that you do have it checked for using the optimized media available. So if you have optimized anything, that it's going to make sure it pulls that for the playback. Another thing you can change here is the timeline proxy resolution. It defaults to full, but you could pull that down to half or even quarter, and it'll help reduce the stress of your system in trying to play back all the things that are going on in your timeline. So spend a little time in that playback section, and it can really help the performance of DaVinci Resolve on your system. I hope this was helpful enough to get you started in DaVinci Resolve. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them down below in the comments section. I am a noob, so I only have a limited amount of information, and as I learn more, I will share more. For all you DaVinci Resolve experts out there, try not to beat me up too much in the comment sections as well. If I missed anything or I got something wrong, please feel free to jump in and give us some better direction on things that we can learn to help improve our own DaVinci Resolve experience. I'll talk to you very soon. Have a great day. Peace.